What's up guys, Derek, moreplates.moredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about how SARMs can potentially be a therapeutic option for hair loss prevention. So a lot of people are probably thinking SARMs anecdotally can cause hair loss. How are they going to help prevent it? So what a lot of people first off don't realize is that the dosages being used for performance enhancement are often significantly exceeding what would be used in an anti-androgenic capacity. So this is sort of not, I don't know, it depends on the SARM though and how tissue selective it is. So some are far better than others. Obviously the more tissue selective, the better. So some SARMs are really no better than certain steroidal SARMs that have better tissue selectivity than testosterone, which are just things that most are commonly known as testosterone. So things like trenbolone, things like, things that are compared to testosterone normally that are anabolic steroids are also referred to in the clinical data as steroidal SARMs simply because they have better tissue selectivity than testosterone. But testosterone, as you should know, is not tissue selective. It sucks in terms of distinguishing between anabolic activity to androgenic activity. It's like the reference steroid used for all studies in terms of what is baseline for tissue selective. So anything that's more tissue selective than testosterone, which is like, as you already know, converts to DHT and can be significantly androgenic via the DHT conversion as well as inherently with the parent hormone, anything better than that is like selective. So there are a lot of steroidal SARMs that have been developed for decades that people use traditionally as, what they often just classify as anabolic steroids, which is fine. But non-steroidal SARMs, these are the ones that are commonly seen as SARMs in the mainstream community nowadays, which is what we're going to be addressing, the non-steroidal ones. And some of those though, the non-steroidal ones have tissue selectivity that are worse than, or formidable to some of the steroidal SARMs that have been around for, decades that people have been using for bodybuilding purposes. So things like something like S23, I talk about all the time about how it really shouldn't even be classified as a SARM simply because it has better tissue selectivity than, the reference parent hormone or something. It doesn't mean it's, very tissue selective. So just because it's classified as a SARM in clinical data, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good or it's like a strong candidate for a good SARM. And this is why it's being looked at in, for replacing female libido and for castration models and all these things that it's blatantly showing a significant amount of androgenic activity and a lack of tissue selectivity. So despite it being, a SARM on paper, it doesn't mean it's a good one. But again, that's, depending on your context. If this is something used for performance enhancement and the aggression and that androgenicity is something being sought after, then potentially it's a therapeutic compound if it has a good safety profile, which remains to be seen in humans. But from the actual purpose we would be using SARMs for, which is maximizing anabolic activity with as much of a lack of that androgenicity as possible, it's a terrible one. So getting into the actual good ones, first off, there's very limited data on the anti-androgen activity of SARMs, but I can explain how this works in practical application with efficacious SARMs, as well as show you some of the clinical data to back this. So first of all, just layman's terms explaining how this works before I just delve into this data and confuse the shit out of you is SARMs have been designed to be selective in what they do. So they will bind to the androgen receptor and transcribe effects in tissues selectively. So you probably already know that, how they're selective for muscle tissue and bone relative to, androgenic affected tissues like prostate, seminal vesicles, blah, 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 blah. So the thing is the way by they can induce their anabolic activity is also a way by they can reduce the androgenic activity of the less selective compounds in your body. So when you have, let's just say, if I took a SARM and it binds to androgen receptors in the body, if it has a high enough binding affinity and it's, there's a high enough dose of it present, it's going to compete with the endogenous testosterone and DHT in my body for androgen receptor activation. In addition to that, it's suppressive to whatever degree depends on the SARM in question. It also depends on the dose being used, how suppressed are you going to be. It's dependent on the, actual chemical structure of the SARM, the dosage being used, etc. But the two mechanisms that I'm referring to in this video with hair loss prevention are, first of all, it's suppressive effect. So it's, it can suppress endogenous testosterone and DHT levels, which in itself is anti-androgenic, which can potentially reduce hair loss. But the main thing is it's essentially an androgen receptor. It competes for the AR. So very similar to what you see with non-steroidal anti-androgens. So these things like bicalutamide, these are things that, even RU58841, these are things that were developed to bind to androgen receptors and prevent testosterone and DHT from binding to transcribe their effects. So indirectly, what they can do is cause those, essentially the androgens you normally produce, to not be able to bind up here or whatever the goal is, but essentially reduce the androgenic activity in the body by docking onto those androgen receptors and preventing the more androgenic hormones from docking and transcribing those effects. So that's why male to female transitioning transgenders will use anti-androgens to either crush their androgen levels, so they'll use like a steroidal anti-androgen to do something like that typically, or they'll use non-steroidal anti-androgens, which are often seen as the more efficacious alternative in conjunction with an estrogen or something like that. And the goal is typically to suppress hormone levels as much as possible and or prevent androgen receptor activation by competing for these sites. But the thing is those compounds are so primitive and so shitty for somebody who's trying to maintain masculinity but prevent hair loss. So this is where SARMs come in, because SARMs are developed off the backbone of these primitive non-steroidal anti-androgens like bicalutamide, things of that nature that have been around for a long time and have been used traditionally for, people trying to become as feminine as possible, reduce masculinity, etc. But the downside of those are, first of all, they have very poor binding affinity, so you typically have to use a lot of it and get a significant amount of side effects in order for it to be effective in an anti-androgen context. In addition, once it binds to those androgen receptors, it has the anti-androgenic effect whereby it prevents testosterone and DHT from doing what they're supposed to do. But the compound doesn't give any sort of anabolic signal like a SARM does. So SARMs, like I mentioned, are developed off the backbone of these chemicals like the bicalutamide, the other non-steroidal anti-androgens, and are upgraded in order to do the exact same thing, bind to the AR, prevent transcription, but they inherently are anabolic. So they can accomplish the same anti-androgen activity, but retain muscle tissue and or even build upon the baseline. So this is where the therapeutic promise of SARMs comes in. And I've probably already done a video on this, at least in some capacity by now. I've recorded a few of them. I just haven't got around to publishing them because the articles are fairly elaborate. And I always want to publish the articles to go along with these. So if I haven't posted it yet, that's why. But anyways, so that's the mechanism whereby this can work, is when you have a SARM that is preventing endogenous androgens from doing what they're supposed to do, it's essentially acting like, the traditional non-steroidal anti-androgens that people are using successfully to regrow their hair, even from like being almost completely bald, but they also retain muscle tissue. And, because there's less androgenicity, there's less masculinization, of course. So in terms of retaining like all facial, all body hair, all everything, it's not necessarily what I mean in terms of retaining all masculinity. The main thing I'm talking about is there's selective anabolism for muscle tissue and bone retention. So in that context, they're far superior to the, more primitive last generation, anti-androgens. So like if somebody like me who's trying to prevent hair loss but maintain a good physique, for example, would I use a high dose of a primitive old compound that basically occupies AR and then has like no signal to help me in any context, and I just lose muscle or stay the same at best? Like, no, that's not what I want. So I would want something that occupies the AR, but then can ideally not just maintain, but I can still build off of, because it has enough anabolic signaling with a lack of that androgenic activity. So that's where these come into play. And in the clinical data, you actually see them stack up against these, traditional anti-androgens and do better than them. And in addition to that, you can actually see how they work alongside androgens to increase anabolic activity in the body and reduce androgenic activity simultaneously via this competitive inhibition effect. So the first one I wanted to show you guys is the I'm sure, this is one of the more mainstream studies that people have seen on RAD140. In this study, you can see the tissue selective agonist activity of RAD140 in castrated immature rats compared to testosterone propionate. So you can see that at a dosage as low as 1 milligram per kilogram, RAD140 pretty much stacks up to the anabolic activity of testosterone with a much lower level of androgenic activity. I've covered this one before, but I'm not sure if I did a very elaborate RAD140 video where I did cover this definitely, but I don't know if I elaborated on this part specifically, the tissue selective and antagonist activity of RAD140. So basically it's showing here that when you use testosterone, you have a certain amount of anabolic activity. When you use RAD140 on its own, you have a certain amount of anabolic activity. But what you see in this too is when you use them together, you have like a 1 + 1 = 3 effect and an anti-androgen activity. So basically they work together to increase muscle mass more. It's not necessarily that they're working together in terms of like they have some sort of chemical reaction, make like a super compound. It's more so they're compounding anabolic activity at the receptor site in terms of androgen receptor activation is accomplishing a higher level of anabolic activity like you'd expect. But the effect the RAD140 has in a competitive inhibition context, in an anti-androgen context, like I mentioned, it reduces the impact that testosterone has on the prostate, which is very, very interesting. So you see here the prostate of the testosterone group, the tissue weight of it compared to the RAD140 group, the prostate weight is, the RAD140 group is like, let's see, percent, it's like 63% of testosterone propionate or something. And that's using 10 milligrams per kilogram relative to testosterone's 1 milligram per kilogram. But when you use 1 milligram per kilogram of testosterone and 10 milligrams per kilogram of RAD140 at the same time, you get more anabolic activity. You get over 20% more anabolic activity than you get with testosterone alone, but you decrease the androgenic activity that you would have otherwise had with the testosterone by almost 20% too. So even though you're still using the same dose of testosterone, the RAD140 has a antagonist effect in androgen affected tissues and simultaneously has a compounding effect in an anabolic context. So not only can these SARMs provide anabolic activity with a relative absence of androgenic activity, depending on the SARM, the dose used, etc., but even in the presence of other exogenous anabolics, they reduce the androgenic impact they have on the body. So very, very interesting and very, very applicable to somebody in a hair loss prevention context, in my opinion, especially somebody looking for the maintenance of what I would, consider a enhanced physique. So moving forward to the more obscure study that I wanted to get into is the Pharmacology Pharmacokinetics and Metabolism of acetylthiolutamide, a novel non-steroidal agonist for the androgen receptor. So this is probably a SARM you've never heard of. Frankly, it's not even worth delving into, in my opinion. This is more so me just showing the mechanism of action and kind of elaborating on this process again. So the reason why this study is useful to look at is it actually compares acetylthiolutamide with bicalutamide, which is, a traditional anti-androgen used for people trying to transition from male to female, as well as those trying to prevent hair loss, as well as those trying to do a myriad of things in an anti-androgen context. But it's not anabolic. It doesn't provide any benefits. It simply is anti-androgenic and can potentially cause a myriad of issues down the line that SARMs simply do not have in a side effect context too. So the results, in vitro AR binding affinity and transcriptional activation. Another thing that should be noted, I think I touched on already, is the binding affinity of these SARMs is significantly better than all these primitive anti-androgens. So not only do you need a much lower dose and they are more effective at actually competitively binding with AR compared to testosterone and DHT, but they're just simply more efficacious compounds in general, not even considering the binding affinities. So acetylthiolutamide competitively displaced mibolerone, which is a steroid, from the AR binding site with a mean Ki value of 4.9 nm. As previously reported, the Ki value of R bicalutamide, a close structural analog and clinically anti-androgen, was 11 nm. Thus, acetylthiolutamide exhibited a higher AR binding affinity than R bicalutamide. I know that sounds kind of weird and contradictory, but it's actually the lower the NM value in the clinical data, the better the binding affinity. So acetylthiolutamide induced AR-mediated transcriptional activation in a concentration-dependent manner. Concentrations of 1, 10, 100, and 500 nm, blah, blah, blah. Results clearly demonstrated that acetylthiolutamide functions as an AR agonist in the mammalian cell context, although less potent than dihydrotestosterone, as expected. Acetylthiolutamide showed an efficacy of transcription activation comparable with dihydrotestosterone. So something that's even formidable, comparable, far better, multiple times better than these stupid anti-androgens that people are still using, unfortunately. So this is the therapeutic promise of SARMs. The identification of acetylthiolutamide as an AR agonist by in vitro experiments prompted us to evaluate its pharmacological activity in animals. Consequently, the androgenic, anabolic, and anti-androgenic activity was tested in a castrated immature rat model. After 14 days of administration, preliminary experiments showed that acetylthiolutamide, blah, blah, blah. Let's see, the results of the androgenic and anabolic assay are shown in figure 2a. Consistent with previous literature reports, castration resulted in a significant reduction in the weights of the prostate, seminal vesicles, and levator any muscle. So basically, when you castrate a rat, it no longer produces these anabolic androgenic hormones like testosterone and DHT. So as you would expect, the prostate, seminal vesicles, completely atrophy, as well as the muscles. So it's just like if you had low testosterone as a male and you lose muscle, like that's an expected consequence, as well as prostate shrinking. Like this is their way. This is why these tissues are dropping in size, is because they're castrating these rodents so they don't have any endogenous hormones. This is also how they reference how potent a compound is, because however much the compound stimulates those tissues, then you can actually assess, okay, it's this potent anabolic, it's this potent androgenic. At least it's a very crude way of assessing it, but it's a way to assess it nonetheless and gives us a good reference point for practical application in humans. So looking at the graph kind of in general, to kind of, without getting too deep into it, because there's a lot of confusing data in here, this is testosterone propionate significantly increases androgenic and anabolic activity. The bicalutamide induces, it's basically like nothing. So it's very anti-androgenic, but it's very anti-anabolic too. And then the acetylthiolutamide caused a small but statistically significant increase in the weight of the prostate after tested subcutaneous and oral doses. But it's small. And you also have to consider this statistical significance is not likely to convey any pharmacological meaning based on the magnitude of the effect. In addition, it had no effect on the weight of seminal vesicles, further indicating a lack of androgenic activity. And it significantly increased the size of the levator any muscle, unlike the R bicalutamide. So it obviously suggests anabolic activity and tissue selectivity. And in addition to that, acetylthiolutamide was able to partly offset the testosterone propionate induced increase in prostate weight in a dose-dependent manner, and noticeably antagonize the effects of testosterone propionate on weights of seminal vesicles and levator any muscle. So it's blatantly showing how it's able to compete for AR activation and essentially induce its tissue selective effects because of its formidable binding affinity to these other androgens, like the testosterone and DHT in the body. So this compound in particular is not something, I would explore as an efficacious, treatment option, simply because it is just a way for me to elaborate on this mechanism of action. There's a lot other SARMs that are, way more anabolic relative to androgenic activity and have higher binding affinities. Like you have things now that have binding affinity is formidable to testosterone, not, like a Ki of 4.9, I don't think is necessarily good. There's things like LGD, which are like literally the exact same as testosterone almost. But like with that being said, this is just a way for me to elucidate on the mechanism of action here of this competitive inhibition and antagonizing the androgenic effects of the endogenous androgens that would otherwise cause androgen effects in the body, namely the hair loss. Follicular miniaturization is the main thing we're actually talking about here. So in a practical application, a very tissue selective SARM can compete, transcribe anabolic effects and be, beneficial in many contexts. And in addition to that, compete with the endogenous DHT and testosterone and offset their negative effects in the hair follicles. So this is where I believe there is not only therapeutic promise in a clinical setting for musculoskeletal degenerative disease, but also for androgen affected, states that are, induced by excess androgens like hair follicle miniaturization. So for somebody, instead of having to go take, a steroidal anti-androgen that is, toxic and just like kills your, mind essentially, and basically makes you like a castrati essentially, like a cyprotorone acetate or something like that. Instead of taking something like, I don't know, some like primitive steroidal anti-androgen that, nukes masculinity, kills muscle mass, kills all these things, and makes you feel like crap just to retain your hair. Something like a SARM can not only bind to the AR with a significantly higher binding affinity and be more effective in an anti-androgen context, but simultaneously induce a significant amount of anabolic activity potentially, depending on the SARM, whichever one. Like obviously this is not a widespread statement that applies to all of them, because as you've seen, there are a variety of SARMs and a lot of them get lumped into this, overarching category, even though some are efficacious and some suck. But, there are several in development that have binding affinities and tissue selectivity that are just, very, very promising, and they're only going to get better from here. So that's where I see the therapeutic promise of them. And in practical application, some SARMs at certain dosages can have this anti-androgenic effect and maintain significantly more anabolic activity than would otherwise be possible, especially with, traditional hardcore treatment options. So that's my stance on that. And then on top of that, there are even individuals who are using it in conjunction with exogenous estradiol, which, has a super anti-androgenic effect, whereby it basically just feeds into the negative feedback loop of the body and tells your body okay, we have enough estrogen, so you can stop producing testosterone because we don't need any more aromatization. So if you have, no testosterone estrogen being produced because the estrogen is being provided from an exogenous source, and then you have a SARM providing the anabolic activity in the body, that's a very, very potent anti-androgenic, protocol that I've seen in practical application work for a handful of individuals very well, and they were still able to achieve what I would consider to be a very, very, high tier physique. And that's, something that why it interested me to begin with, is these guys achieving these crazy physiques even while keeping all their hair with super aggressive hair loss. So that's where the therapeutic promise lies. I don't necessarily recommend doing that because there are concerns when it comes to unopposed estrogens in terms of cancer cell growth and things of that nature. But with that being said, no one knows what kind of effect SARMs have when it comes to balancing out that androgen to estrogen ratio, in terms of what, like, no one even knows about that to begin with, let alone what kind of impact SARMs are going to have with it. But so that's just my disclaimer on that I have no idea what kind of effect it's actually going to have when you have unopposed estrogen with if you were to go down that route of the SARMs plus estrogen route. However, it could potentially be something that, I don't know, gets like deployed in the short term to induce a state of way better androgen activity relative to, loss, and then regrowing dead zones, and then getting back to good ground, and then getting back to a level of stable androgen to estrogen ratio of normal endogenous androgens, and then trying to maintain from there with a, competitive antagonist like a low dose SARM or something. There's a lot of ways to go about this, but at the end of the day, I'm just kind of outlining the mechanism of action and what I see as a potential therapeutic forward-looking treatment, rather than relying on these primitive, anti-androgens that are, going to just like strip you of masculinity and muscle mass in order to retain your hair, when there's better alternatives, in my opinion. So take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplatesmoredates.com. Check me out on Instagram. Follow me there at moreplates_moredates. Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, BitChute, wherever else I am. Apple Podcasts. Definitely subscribe to the newsletter, and the link in the description below, because these videos, I kind of just ramble all over the place, and they're always organized in like very concise subsections with table of contents. Any clinical study I mention is referenced there for you to click on if you want to go look into it further yourself. And none of that stuff is done in the videos. I kind of just ramble like crazy in these, and then sometimes go on tangents and whatnot. So if you want to like have a more palatable version of this sent to you right when it gets published, I highly recommend you subscribe to the newsletter below, because that's how you're going to get, the only way you're going to get sent them when they get released. So a lot of incentive to do that. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.